Those who don't know me, my name's Madeline Forrester, and myself and my colleague Mike Kantara are going to deliver the next session, so thank you very much for coming and listening to us. At MFS, we passionately believe that active management has an important role to play in reducing deficits, as Phil alluded to in the earlier session. And because of that, we've been doing some work globally to look at the active-passive debate in more detail and to make sure that we can help our clients and prospective clients to take a fully informed view on that decision. Like many today, we believe the answer probably comes for most people in a blend of the two, but this session is going to focus exclusively on active. We've done two pieces of work. The first is a study to look at the benefits of active management, but most importantly, not just whether the skill exists, but how you can identify it and whether it's sustainable. And Mike's going to talk about that in his section. I'm going to focus on the first piece of work we've done, which is a global survey to understand better what you all think about active versus passive. The survey is global, so the UK part of the sample is actually quite low, as you'd expect given the makeup of markets, but it includes investors from the States, from Latin America, and from Asia Pacific. And actually I think it's quite interesting, given that one of the reasons we're all being asked to collaborate is to become more like some of our global competitors. This is an interesting time to compare our attitudes with those of others. This first slide shows UK institutional investors' predictions of future asset flows compared to other global investors. And the LGPS made up about 25% of the UK sample. What you can see is that the UK is predicting a far greater move from active to passive than other investors elsewhere in the world. We're predicting about 100% increase. Others are predicting about 50%. So reasonably meaningful. Well, you would expect, given that we must have less confidence in active management. That's actually not that true. And particularly if we look at those who are highly confident, what we see here is that UK institutional investors are just as highly confident in active as their international peers. There is some difference in those who have low and moderate confidence, but again, it doesn't seem to be as significant as the predictions would imply. So we asked people a number of questions, and I'm not, you'll be pleased to know, going to go through them all, but you will find on your tables a copy of this presentation, and hopefully you'll find it interesting to look at some of the things that we asked all of these global investors. What was interesting to me when looking at the survey is that the UK doesn't seem any less convinced that active management offers superior risk management controls than passive does, and I know some of the speakers touched on that this morning, or that outperformance won't come from active management over the long term, say the 5 to 10 years' time. What does become very clear, though, from the survey is that UK institutional investors are less convinced about the cost of active management. And you can see this right at the bottom, where 45% of people are not convinced that active management is worth the cost, compared to actually 18% of investors globally. And this is actually backed up by this second chart, and again I won't go through it all, but I am willing to pay more for active management. Considerably less people are. And interestingly, taking everything into consideration, actively managed investments are the best option for meeting long-term performance goals. Again, sees about half as many people responding positively as globally. Now, what I would suggest is that this is a sign that investors, taking everything into account, are coming under pressure, as we know all of yourselves are doing, to consider fees as a higher criteria than some of the benefits of active management. And if we are looking to learn from overseas investors, it's worth us taking that comparison into account. And before I hand over to Mike, I'm going to touch on one other chart which I thought was also interesting. And this shows the percentage of people who are prepared to pay for managers who can consistently outperform over different time periods. In this case, 1, 3, 5, and 10 years.
Hasn't had the opportunity to shine, and maybe I'm biased, I will admit in saying that, but I do think that thinking about when active management really outperforms most significantly is oftentimes in the most difficult markets. When we see a spike in volatility, which is starting to happen, when we see more divergence from an economic growth and central bank policy, which again is starting to happen. So when you look at that, you can really think about that in the most dispersed markets or the least dispersed markets. So the least dispersed markets basically are those that when everything is either going up or everything going down. And that's when the average active manager hasn't added value, but the top managers have. But the most dispersed markets, when there is more opportunity through that selection process, is really when both have shined, but the top active managers have really added significant value, and that's what you see on the leftmost side of that slide. The other part of that I was referring to is rising and falling markets. And again, even the average median active manager has outperformed on the right-hand side during falling markets over this time frame, and you can see the significant value added from the more skilled or top quartile active managers. The top quartile managers have also outperformed in rising markets, but I think there is a difference there that we should expect that protection on the downside, and that's again going back to my earlier point, where does risk management fit into the investment process, to the organizational structure or culture. The other attribute that comes up, and this was interesting to me as we looked at some of the information, the second item here, long-term investment focus, was identified as being very important. But high active share is at the bottom of the list. Hopefully you all can see that either on the screen or in the pack. And so there isn't really an acceptance of this combination, but I do think it's important to consider as part of your decision-making process and thinking about where to allocate and how to allocate. And those two things, again, based on information and data that we've produced, as well as some of the academic studies, really are starting to focus on that a bit more. Why is that important? Well, I think we see what's happening in the world around us. I mentioned some of the market dynamics that are happening, but this focus on short-term results continues to be an issue, I think, across the industry, and one that really does need to be addressed. That does create opportunities for active managers to be nimble, to be able to take advantage of those overreactions in the marketplace, either when things are overreacting positively or negatively, to step in. We're seeing greater volatility. I think we should expect greater, volatility, and certainly more complexity has all been part of the mix. And that's really where having a focus on security selection is better able, to make a distinction between those long-term winners in a particular industry versus those companies that may struggle. Part of this short-term focus, or short-termism as we often refer to it, has been evident for some time, and this is just some data from the New York Stock Exchange that shows the average holding period of less than 2 years. So, I think when we look at what liabilities we're trying to match to or what we're trying to invest for, there are probably, very few situations where a less than 2-year holding period is really appropriate. So thinking about what the long-term implications are, and then coupling that with this idea around risk management and downside protection of capital is a concept that is increasingly important, I think, to all of us as investors, but certainly something that active management can really help to focus on. This is just a listing of events that have caused volatility in the market over time. We haven't updated this recently. We could probably put China or central bank concerns in the upper right-hand corner, which has lended, to some of the volatility or increased the overall volatility in the market as of late. But we should expect that there's going to be ebbs and flows in terms of not only market cycles, but the volatility that's associated with that. And so active management can play a role in helping with that. The complexity point is one where if you think about how do we get at that, how do we think about being able to find opportunities in a global marketplace, this is certainly not anything new, but one that continues to be important. If you look on the left-hand side, this is just showing each of the major regions around the world and what percentage of the revenue of the companies in that region actually come from outside the region. So again, lots of examples that we can think of, whether it's in technology or consumer goods, companies based in the UK or in Europe or in the US are very much interdependent on what's happening in other parts of the world. So having that complexity really does require a team and a collaborative decision-making process that goes along with that. Innovation is driving a lot of that with the rapid pace of change that's taking place as well. So one of the other factors here just to look at is what are the big concerns? Well, this is based on the survey that was done on a global basis, and not surprisingly, government deficits and geopolitical instability really rise to the top of the list. The second from the bottom, rising inflation doesn't seem to be a big worry globally or here in the UK, but again, not surprisingly, but some of those deficit issues as well as geopolitical risk will, I think, continue to be a source of volatility in the market, something that we all are paying attention to, I'm sure. So let me summarize here and just say a couple of other things, and then we can see if there are any questions. But for institutional investors globally that we talk to, there has been a move to passive, and certainly that seems to be a bit more pronounced in the UK. And it does appear to be led by cost pressure. So I'm not going to deny that those cost pressures are real, they're tangible, but are they short term? Are you giving up an opportunity as a result of those cost pressures? I think that's an important consideration. When you look at the net of fee performance over the long term through many different types of active management, then I think there's good value there, is really the point I would make. Collectively, as a group, on average, active management, almost by definition, will not beat the market. But I think we can identify or find ways of identifying skilled active managers that can contribute to returns, help to reduce risk through diversification, and therefore help with reducing the funding deficits. And I think we've seen additional evidence of changes in the marketplace over the last, month and a half or so, and I think that's, something that's likely to continue, and therefore opportunities for active management are on the rise, not decreasing, despite, competition from a number of different areas. So with that, I'll stop there, and I think either Maddie or I would be happy to take any questions that you may have.